The Velithari Dominion had conquered 600 worlds across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy, and they had done so with the cold efficiency of a species that considered warfare to be nothing more than mathematics. Their armada numbered 12,000 warships, each one a mountain of metal and fire that could reduce a planet to ash in a matter of hours. High Commander Yethris stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Verdict, watching the stars slide past as his fleet moved through the void. He had overseen the subjugation of 47 species in his career, and not once had he encountered a challenge worthy of his attention. When his scouts returned with data about the newest species in their path, Yethris barely looked up from his tactical display. "Humans," his intelligence officer reported, her voice carrying the bored tone of someone delivering routine information. "They have spread to 47 systems over 3 of their centuries, but their expansion follows no logical pattern." Yethris flicked through the data with mild interest. The images showed a species of soft-skinned bipeds with no natural armor, no claws, no venom glands, and no telepathic abilities. Their ships were a chaotic mess of different designs, as if each colony had built whatever it wanted with no coordination from any central authority. "No unified government?" Yethris asked, though he already suspected the answer. "None that we can identify, High Commander," the officer replied. "They appear to have dozens of independent governments, and our analysts have recorded at least 15 separate conflicts between human factions in the past century alone." Yethris allowed himself a rare smile. A fractured species was the easiest kind to conquer, because they would waste precious time arguing among themselves while his fleet burned their worlds. He had seen it happen countless times before. "What of their military capabilities?" he asked. "Minimal and inconsistent," the officer answered. "Some colonies have defense platforms, others have nothing at all, and their warship designs are so varied that they cannot possibly coordinate effectively in battle." Yethris nodded and turned to his communications officer. "Transmit the standard demands for unconditional surrender," he commanded. "Give them 1 rotation cycle to respond before we begin the conquest." The message was sent, a formal declaration that the Velithari Dominion claimed all human territories, and that resistance would result in complete annihilation. Yethris expected the usual response: panic, desperate attempts at negotiation, perhaps a futile show of defiance from some foolish military commander. What he received was silence. 1 cycle passed, then another, and then a third. No response came from any human world. No surrender, no defiance, no communication of any kind. "Perhaps their communication systems are too primitive to receive our transmission," his intelligence officer suggested. "Perhaps," Yethris agreed, though something about the silence made him uneasy in a way he could not explain. "No matter, we will deliver our message in person." He gave the order to advance, and 12,000 warships crossed the invisible boundary into human space. What Yethris did not know, what he could not possibly have known, was that his transmission had been received by every human colony within minutes of its broadcast. Deep space relay stations that had sat dormant for decades suddenly hummed with activity, passing the alien message from system to system at speeds that would have seemed impossible to the Velithari. On Earth, in a bunker buried 3 kilometers beneath the Swiss Alps, a computer system that had not been activated since its creation 2 centuries ago began running protocols that most humans had forgotten existed. On Mars, automated factories that had been mothballed and sealed received silent commands and began warming their fusion cores. On 1,000 colonies scattered across human space, emergency systems woke from their long sleep and began preparations that had been planned for generations. And in every human home, on every human world, people received a quiet alert on their personal devices. "Contact Protocol 7, this is not a drill." Most humans had never heard of Contact Protocol 7. It was not taught in schools or discussed in the media. But every government official, every military officer, and every emergency coordinator knew exactly what it meant. First contact had been made, and the newcomers were hostile. For 300 years, humanity had expanded into the stars with a question burning in the back of their collective mind. Are we alone? And if not, will they be friendly? They had hoped for the best but prepared for the worst, because that was what humans did. They had nearly destroyed themselves in the 21st century, coming within a hair's breadth of extinction through war and environmental collapse. That trauma had left a mark on the species, a deep and abiding paranoia that shaped everything they built. Every colony, no matter how small or remote, had been constructed with hidden defenses. Every civilian ship could be converted to military use within hours. Every citizen received basic combat training as part of their education. Humanity had looked out at the vast and silent universe and concluded that anything out there was probably dangerous until proven otherwise. Now, as the Velithari Armada advanced toward their first target, humans across dozens of worlds began to move with quiet purpose. There was no panic, no chaos, no desperate scrambling. There was only the calm efficiency of a species that had spent 3 centuries preparing for exactly this moment. On the bridge of the Eternal Verdict, High Commander Yethris reviewed his invasion plans with satisfaction. He expected the conquest of human space to take perhaps 6 months, a year at most if the scattered colonies put up more resistance than anticipated. He would add another 47 worlds to the Dominion's territory, enslave another species to serve the Empire, and return home to receive honors and promotions. He had no way of knowing that he had just made the worst mistake in the history of his species. He had no way of knowing that across human space, something ancient and terrible was beginning to stir. He had no way of knowing that humanity had been sleeping, and he had just woken them up. The war that would destroy the Velithari Dominion had begun, and they did not even realize it yet. The Velithari chose Kepler 442b as their first target because it seemed like an easy victory. It was a small mining colony on the edge of human space, home to only 80,000 people who spent their days extracting rare metals from the planet's crust. The colony had 3 orbital stations that appeared on Velithari sensors as simple civilian platforms, and the planet itself showed no signs of military infrastructure. Strike Commander Vorath led a fleet of 200 ships toward the colony, expecting to achieve complete conquest within a single day. He transmitted the standard ultimatum as his ships approached: surrender immediately or face total destruction. This time, unlike before, the humans responded. A single voice came through the communication channel, calm and almost bored in its tone. Velithari Fleet, this is Kepler Defense Coordinator Chen, and I am authorized to inform you that your ultimatum is rejected. Vorath was amused by the response. You have 3 orbital stations and no warships, he replied. What exactly do you intend to defend with? There was a pause, and then Coordinator Chen spoke again. You should have done better research. The 3 orbital stations began to chain. Panels slid open along their hulls, revealing rows of missile tubes and energy weapon batteries that had been hidden behind false walls. Cargo containers attached to the stations detached and unfolded into autonomous weapons platforms, each one bristling with guns. Mining vessels that had been drifting nearby dumped their ore loads and activated hidden weapon systems, transforming from harmless civilian ships into deadly attack craft. And on the planet's surface, massive doors opened in what the Velithari had assumed were strip mines, revealing railgun batteries that began tracking the invading fleet. Vorath watched in disbelief as the harmless mining colony transformed into a fortress before his eyes. "All ships open fire," he commanded, but his voice carried a hint of uncertainty that his crew had never heard before. The battle for Kepler 442b lasted 9 hours. The Velithari won, but the cost was staggering. 63 ships were destroyed, and another 40 were damaged so badly that they had to be abandoned. Over 15,000 Velithari soldiers died, fighting through the colony's bunker networks. Where human civilians fought alongside trained militia with weapons they had kept hidden in their homes. When it was over, Voreth stood in the ruins of the colony's command center and tried to understand what had just happened. His soldiers brought him captured data files, and what he found inside them shook him to his core. The files described something called the doctrine of paranoid redundancy. It was a strategic philosophy that had been adopted by all of humanity after they nearly destroyed themselves in a series of devastating wars centuries ago. The doctrine was simple: prepare for the worst possible scenario and then prepare for something even worse. Every human colony, no matter how small or peaceful it appeared, was built with hidden military capabilities. Every orbital station had concealed weapons. Every civilian ship could be armed. Every underground facility included bunkers stocked with supplies and weapons. And every human citizen received training in combat, survival, and resistance tactics. The humans had looked at the universe and decided that they could not trust anyone or anything. They had spent 300 years building a civilization that could survive any attack, any invasion, any catastrophe. And they had done it so quietly that no one outside of human space had any idea. Voreth sent his report to High Commander Yethris with a strong recommendation: reconsider the invasion. Yethris read the report and dismissed it as the excuses of a commander who had underestimated his enemy. "One colony caught us off guard," he told his officers. "It will not happen again, and we will simply bring more force to bear on future targets." He ordered the Armada to continue its advance, sending larger fleets to each target system. But the pattern repeated itself at every colony they attacked. Mining stations revealed hidden weapon batteries. Agricultural worlds had underground bunker complexes that took weeks to clear. Even tiny research outposts fought back with ferocity that the Velithari had never encountered. And all the while, the cost in ships and soldiers climbed higher and higher. Worse still, the humans were learning from each engagement. They studied Velithari tactics and adapted their defenses. They shared information between colonies through communication networks that the Velithari could not intercept or jam. They began launching guerrilla attacks on Velithari supply lines, using small ships that appeared from nowhere and vanished before the enemy could respond. 3 months into the invasion, High Commander Yethris received a report that made his blood run cold. Human shipyards across their territory had begun producing warships at an impossible rate. The Ares foundries on Mars, which Velithari intelligence had listed as abandoned industrial facilities, were now launching a new warship every 18 hours. Lunar factories that had been dormant for 2 centuries were building fighters and bombers by the thousands. And Earth itself, the human homeworld that Yethris had planned to save for last as a symbolic prize, had revealed itself to be the most heavily fortified planet the Velithari had ever seen. Orbital defense platforms surrounded the planet in overlapping layers. Ground-based weapons could strike targets in high orbit. The entire population of 12 billion was mobilizing for war. Yethris realized with growing horror that he had made a terrible miscalculation. He had assumed that humanity's lack of unity was a weakness. He had assumed that their scattered colonies and varied ship designs meant they could not coordinate. He had assumed that they were unprepared for war. But the truth was far worse. Humanity had not unified, because they had never needed to. Their scattered structure was not a weakness but a strength, a design that meant there was no single point of failure for an enemy to exploit. And they had not been unprepared for war. They had been preparing for 300 years, quietly building the infrastructure for a conflict they hoped would never come. Now that conflict had arrived, and the sleeping giant was finally awake. Yethris stared at the reports and wondered, for the first time in his long career, if he had led his fleet into a war they could not win. But it was too late to turn back now. The Velathari Dominion had never retreated from a conquest, and Yethris would not be the first commander to break that tradition. He would push forward, throw more ships at the humans, and crush them through sheer force of numbers. It was the only strategy he knew, and he clung to it even as the casualty reports grew longer with each passing day. He did not yet understand that he was no longer fighting to conquer. He was fighting to survive. 6 months into the invasion, the Velathari Dominion controlled 18 human systems. On paper, this looked like progress. In reality, it was a catastrophe. The Armada that had entered human space with 12,000 ships now numbered fewer than 9,000, and many of those were damaged and in need of repair. Supply lines stretched across hostile territory, where human raiders struck without warning. Occupied colonies required constant military presence to prevent uprisings, tying down troops that were needed elsewhere. And the humans just kept fighting. High Commander Yethris had expected the scattered human colonies to fall one by one, each victory making the next easier. Instead, the opposite was happening. Every colony the Velathari attacked sent out warnings to its neighbors. Every battle taught the humans new tactics. Every Velathari ship destroyed was studied and analyzed so that human weapons could become more effective. The humans were not fighting as individuals. They were fighting as a single organism with millions of parts, each one learning and adapting and sharing knowledge with all the others. And now, after 6 months of buying time with blood and sacrifice, the human war machine was finally ready. The first sign came at the Tau Ceti system, where a Velathari patrol fleet of 30 ships was conducting a routine sweep. Without warning, 200 human warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and surrounded them. The Velathari commander barely had time to send a distress signal before his entire fleet was destroyed in a battle that lasted less than 20 minutes. Similar attacks happened across occupied space. Human fleets appeared from nowhere, struck with overwhelming force, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Listening posts were destroyed. Supply convoys were ambushed. Garrison forces on occupied worlds found themselves cut off and alone. Yethris demanded to know where these fleets were coming from. His intelligence officers worked frantically to find answers, and what they discovered terrified them. The ships were coming from everywhere. Some came from the major human worlds like Earth and Mars, where the great shipyards had been working around the clock for months. Some came from smaller colonies that had hidden their military production facilities underground. Some came from generation ships, massive vessels that had been wandering the void for decades and had now turned toward the war. And some came from places that did not appear on any chart, hidden military bases and dead systems where the humans had been stockpiling warships for centuries. The Velathari had assumed they were invading a disorganized civilization. They were actually invading a trap that had been 300 years in the making. The human fleets did not operate like any military the Velathari had ever encountered. There was no single command structure, no central authority giving orders. Instead, hundreds of independent battle groups moved according to a shared tactical network. They could coordinate without communication, anticipate each other's moves, and adapt to changing situations in real time. It was like fighting a swarm of insects that shared a single mind. Strike one group, and another would appear to take its place. Destroy a command ship, and the rest of the fleet would continue fighting without hesitation. The Velithari military was built on the assumption that every enemy had a head that could be cut off. But humanity had no head. It was a hydra, and every time the Velithari cut off one part, two more grew back. Yethris called a war council aboard his flagship, gathering his senior commanders to discuss their options. The mood was grim. "We have lost 3,000 ships in 6 months," his fleet admiral reported. "At this rate, we will have nothing left within a year." "We cannot retreat," another commander insisted. "The Dominion has never abandoned a conquest, and if we withdraw now, every species we have subjugated will see it as weakness." "Then what do you suggest?" Yethris demanded. "We cannot continue as we are, and we cannot pull back." "We must strike at their heart," the fleet admiral said. "If we can reach Earth and destroy their homeworld, the rest of their colonies will lose hope and surrender." It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had left. Yethris ordered the remaining fleet to consolidate and prepare for a massive push toward Sol, the human home system. Every ship that could be spared from occupation duty was recalled. Every damaged vessel that could still fight was pressed back into service. The Velithari would gather their remaining strength and strike at Earth with everything they had. Meanwhile, the humans were preparing their own plans. Admiral Sarah Okonkwo stood on the bridge of her flagship, the UES Defiance, and reviewed the intelligence reports with cold satisfaction. The Velithari were doing exactly what human strategists had predicted. Faced with an enemy they could not defeat through attrition, they were gambling everything on a single decisive strike. It was a strategy that had worked for them many times before. Against other species, it probably would have worked again. But humans were different. Humans had spent their entire history fighting each other, and they knew every trick in the book. They knew that an enemy who was desperate would take risks. They knew that an enemy who was focused on one goal would ignore everything else. And they knew exactly how to exploit both of those weaknesses. Admiral Okonkwo gave the order, and human fleets across the theater began to move. They did not try to stop the Velithari advance toward Sol. Instead, they let them come, falling back in a controlled retreat that made the aliens think they were winning. They wanted the Velithari fleet to commit fully to the attack. They wanted every enemy ship in one place at one time. Because the humans were not planning to defend Earth. They were planning to end the war in a single battle. At a place called Proxima Reach, halfway between the outer colonies and Sol, the largest human fleet ever assembled was gathering in the shadow of a dead star. 3,000 warships waited in the darkness, their systems powered down, invisible to Velithari sensors. And when the enemy fleet arrived, they would spring the trap. The Velithari were walking into an ambush that would decide the fate of 2 civilizations. They just did not know it yet. The Velithari Armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Proxima Reach system, with 4,000 ships, every vessel they could gather for the final push toward Earth. High Commander Yethris stood on the bridge of the Eternal Verdict and surveyed his fleet with pride. This was the largest Velithari force ever assembled for a single battle, a wall of metal and firepower that would crush any resistance. Human scouts had been tracking their approach for days, but that did not concern Yethris. Let the humans see what was coming. Let them tremble at the sight of Velithari might. "All ships, advance toward the transit point," he commanded. "We will punch through any defense they have and be at Earth within 3 days." The Armada began to move, engines flaring as thousands of warships accelerated toward their target. They were halfway across the system when the first anomaly appeared on their sensors. "Commander," the sensor officer reported, his voice uncertain, "I am detecting power signatures emerging from the asteroid field ahead." "How many ships?" Yethras asked. There was a long pause before the officer answered. "At current count, approximately 3,000, and the number is still rising." Yethras felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. 3,000 ships was more than human forces should have been able to gather in one place. It was more than human shipyards should have been able to produce. And yet there they were, rising from hiding places among the asteroids like ghosts materializing from the void. The human fleet did not wait for the Velathari to react. Admiral Sarah Okonkwo gave a single command, and 3,000 ships surged forward in perfect coordination. The battle began. From the first moments, it was clear that this fight would be different from any the Velathari had experienced before. Human ships were faster than their Velathari counterparts, able to maneuver in ways that seemed to defy physics. Human weapons hit harder than expected, punching through Velathari armor with brutal efficiency. Human pilots flew with a reckless aggression that the Velathari found deeply unsettling. But the most terrifying thing was the humans' willingness to die. Velathari soldiers valued their lives and fought to survive. Human crews treated their own survival as secondary to the mission. Damaged human ships did not retreat to safety. They accelerated toward the nearest enemy vessel and detonated their reactors, taking their killers with them. Fighters that had exhausted their ammunition rammed Velathari warships, trading one small craft for massive capital ships. It was not rational. It was not sane. It was human. Yethras watched in horror as his fleet was torn apart by an enemy that seemed to have no fear of death. He tried to rally his forces, to form defensive formations, to coordinate counterattacks. But the humans gave him no time to think. Every time he tried to stabilize one part of the battle, another part collapsed. Every order he gave was countered before it could be executed. It was as if the humans could read his mind. The truth was simpler, but no less devastating. Human military doctrine was built on thousands of years of warfare against the most dangerous enemy in the universe, other humans. Every tactic the Velathari used had been tried before by some human general somewhere in history. Every strategy Yethras attempted had a counter that human officers learned in their first year of training. The humans were not smarter than the Velathari. They were just more experienced at killing. 3 hours into the battle, Yethras received a report that broke his spirit. His fleet had lost 2,000 ships, fully half of the force he had brought to this system. Human losses were less than 500. The mathematics were clear. He could not win this battle. He could not even escape it. "All ships retreat," he commanded, desperation cracking his voice. "Fall back to the transit point." But the humans were not interested in letting them retreat. Admiral Okonkwo had given strict orders. No Velathari ship was to leave this system. This was not a battle to defend human space. This was a battle to end the war. Human ships pursued the retreating Velathari with relentless fury. They hunted down stragglers and destroyed them. They blocked escape routes and forced enemy vessels into killing zones. They showed no mercy, because mercy was not part of the plan. The doctrine of disproportionate response was humanity's answer to a hostile universe. When attacked, humans did not seek to repel the enemy. They sought to destroy them so completely that no one would ever consider attacking again. It was a philosophy born from millennia of human conflict, from the understanding that half measures only invited future aggression. The only way to ensure peace was to make war so terrible that no one would dare start one. By the battle's end, the Velathari Armada had been reduced to fewer than 1,000 ships. Yethras himself survived only because his flagship's crew sacrificed themselves to give him time to escape. As his damaged vessel limped away from the carnage, he received a transmission from the human fleet. Admiral Okonkwo's face appeared on his screen, calm and cold and utterly without pity. "High Commander Yethris," she said, "you came to conquer, but we came to end this, and there is a difference." Yethris had no response. He had led the greatest military force in Velithari history into battle, and it had been annihilated in a single day. "Return to your masters," Okonkwo continued, "and tell them what you have witnessed, because what happened here today is only the beginning." The transmission ended, and Yethris was left alone with the knowledge of what he had done. He had awakened humanity. He had forced them to remember what they were capable of. And now they were coming, not to defend their territory, but to ensure that the Velithari would never threaten anyone again. The war was not over. For the Velithari Dominion, the worst was yet to come. The news of the disaster at Proxima Reach spread through the Velithari Dominion like a plague. For the first time in their history, a Velithari armada had been utterly destroyed. For the first time, their enemies were not running but advancing. For the first time, the conquerors were the ones facing conquest. High Commander Yethris returned to the Dominion homeworld with fewer than 1,000 ships, and a warning that his leaders did not want to hear. "We cannot win this war," he told the Supreme Council, his voice hollow with defeat. "The humans are not what we thought they were, and if we continue to fight, they will destroy us." The Council did not listen. They could not accept that their empire, which had dominated 600 worlds for millennia, could be threatened by a species they had dismissed as primitive and disorganized. They ordered the reserves mobilized. They demanded new ships from every colony. They swore that the Dominion would crush this human rebellion or die trying. They got their wish. The human counteroffensive began 3 weeks after Proxima Reach. Human fleets struck Velithari-occupied worlds with overwhelming force, liberating colony after colony in battles that were barely contests. Human ships appeared in systems that the Velithari had considered safely behind their lines, attacking shipyards and supply depots. Human soldiers landed on Velithari military bases and captured them with terrifying efficiency. The Dominion's response was chaos. Commanders who had never faced a real threat in their careers panicked and made mistakes. Fleets were sent to defend locations that had already fallen. Resources were wasted on desperate counterattacks that achieved nothing. And all the while, the humans kept coming. They did not stop to negotiate. They did not offer terms. They simply destroyed everything in their path with cold, methodical precision. 6 months after the counteroffensive began, human ships entered the Velithari home system. The Dominion's last fleet met them at the outer defense perimeter. 800 warships crewed by soldiers who knew they were fighting for the survival of their species. The battle lasted 12 hours. When it was over, the Velithari had nothing left. Admiral Okonkwo's flagship, the Defiance, took position in orbit above the Velithari homeworld. Below, 12 billion Velithari waited to learn their fate. They expected the humans to do what the Dominion would have done: bombard their cities, enslave their people, strip their world of resources, and leave them with nothing. Instead, they received a transmission. "People of the Velithari Dominion," Admiral Okonkwo's voice echoed across every communication channel on the planet. "Your government declared war on humanity, and that war is now over. You expected us to conquer you as you would have conquered us, but we are not you. We do not want your territory, we do not want your resources, and we do not want slaves. What we want is simple: we want to be left alone. Your military will be dismantled, your weapons will be destroyed, and your empire will end. But your people will live. Your worlds will remain yours, and your civilization will survive. Learn from what has happened here, and never threaten humanity again." The terms of surrender were signed aboard the Defiance 3 days later. The Velithari Supreme Council, agreed to everything the humans demanded because they had no choice. The greatest military power in the known galaxy had been broken in 18 months by a species they had dismissed as weak and divided. In the years that followed, the Velithari Dominion collapsed into dozens of independent states. Species they had conquered for millennia seized the opportunity to break free. The empire that had ruled 600 worlds simply ceased to exist. And across the galaxy, other civilizations watched and learned. They had seen what happened to those who attacked humanity. They had seen the sleeping giant wake, and they had seen what it did to those who disturbed its rest. Ambassadors from 100 species traveled to human space, seeking treaties of friendship and non-aggression. They came with gifts and promises and declarations of peaceful intent. They came because they were terrified of what would happen if they did not. The humans received them politely and signed treaties that guaranteed peace. But they never stopped building ships. They never deactivated their defense networks. They never closed their hidden shipyards or emptied their bunkers. Because humanity had learned something that the rest of the galaxy was only beginning to understand. The universe was vast and dangerous, and the Velithari would not be the last threat. There would be others, species that were stronger, smarter, more ruthless. And when they came, humanity would be ready. In a speech broadcast to every human world, the President of the United Earth Council addressed her species. "We did not seek this war," she said, "and we take no joy in what we were forced to do. But let the galaxy understand this. Humanity has been tested before by enemies within and without, and we have survived every test. We will argue among ourselves, because that is our nature. We will compete and quarrel and disagree about everything. But when something threatens our species, all of our species, we remember that we are one people. And we respond accordingly." Decades passed, and then centuries. The Velithari became a cautionary tale taught in military academies across the galaxy. Do not attack the humans. Do not threaten their worlds. Do not make them remember what they are. Let them sleep. Because no one wanted to see what happened when they woke up. And deep in the heart of human space, life went on. Children were born and grew old and had children of their own. Colonies expanded and new worlds were settled. Humanity continued its chaotic, disorganized, wonderfully unpredictable existence. But the shipyards never stopped building. The bunkers stayed stocked. The defense networks remained active. And in encrypted files stored in secure facilities across human space, updated plans waited for the next enemy foolish enough to test humanity's resolve. The galaxy had entered a new era, one defined by a simple truth. Humanity was awake now, and they would never sleep again.